All right, well, thank you so much for coming, especially given the weather. It's absolutely fantastic. So what we have planned tonight is I'm going to ask Bobbi Ann some questions. Eventually, we'll turn it over to you. But just to really tee things up, I'm just going to explain a little bit of some of my research. And as you leave this evening, aside from learning even more why Bobbi Ann is such a fantastic person, I'm hoping that you'll also learn a little bit more about how there are some challenges in Canadian democracy. And as bad as you may think things are, there are some things that I can tell you that are actually it's a lot worse than you think. But so just to give you that, but I really want to start by saying that almost everybody who puts their name on a ballot is actually somebody who is trying to help their community. It is not like you see in the Hollywood movies. The majority of people, the vast majority of people throughout Canada who run for office are doing it for the right reasons. The problem is we have a system that really constrains their ability to represent Canadians. And so they come into it. If you've ever seen the movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, it's that kind of thing, okay, where they come into it and they're idealistic and they've got lots of plans and lots of ideas, and slowly the system starts creeping down and compressing and compressing and compressing. And for some of them, they end up making a big scene and they end up rebelling and they end up being really frustrated, and some of them quit and some of them change parties and this sort of thing. And occasionally, every so often, some of them end up getting reelected as an independent, and very rarely do you have somebody who for the first time when they run, they get elected as an independent as you managed to pull off. So I'm just going to give you some idea of some of the things I've researched, and then we're gonna chat. So just very, very quickly, just to situate so you know where I'm coming from. I'm originally from Ottawa. I ended up moving to Newfoundland. I was a professor there in Canadian politics for 17 years, and then I became a professor at Acadia University in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, and I live in Halifax. And the research that I do involves talking to Canadian politicians. And so the books that were mentioned, the first one that was mentioned was one about examining how Stephen Harper as Prime Minister really had a clamp down on what it was that could be said about his government. And the thing about that particular study was that so many things that were alarmist about what was happening when Stephen Harper was in power, and this is not a comment on whether Stephen Harper was good or bad, it's just the way things were. So many things that people were alarmed about actually became normalized under Justin Trudeau. And I'll give you one example. When Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, I was one of the people who was paying a lot of attention to his image management. And photographs were being issued every now and then by his official photographer, and bandwidth wasn't great at the time. It was really hard to actually send out photographs. It was very limited. But journalists were getting really frustrated because the Prime Minister's office was taking the photographs, not giving journalists access, and they were the ones putting out the photos. And now journalists across the country were saying, well, what are we going to do here? Like, do we run these photographs or not? And this is really bad for journalism. And so journalists were writing all these things about how Stephen Harper was this control freak and it was about media management and all this sort of thing. And yes, he did have a lot of fights with the Parliamentary Press Gallery and all this sort of thing. Well, Justin Trudeau gets in and has a much better relationship with journalists and was very friendly with them and this sort of thing. But gradually over time, the system took over him too. And what ended up happening with the photographs is he had an official photographer who went absolutely everywhere and still does, goes all over the place with him, takes backstage photographs all the time and issues them on social media on a regular basis. And journalists don't put up a stink anymore because they're just like, well, that's just normal now. And premiers do it across the country. And you can be sure that Prime Minister Mark Carney is going to do the same thing, and Prime Minister Pierre Poilievre is going to do the same thing. This is just the way things are. And what happens is that things that we get upset about and concerned about eventually happen so often that we stop talking about them and we accept them as normal. And this is why it takes people like you to not put up with it. Because the system makes things difficult for individual representation. Things nowadays, and some of this a lot of you will know, and some of it you may not know, but when you want to run now to be a candidate with a political party, one of the first things they do is they give you a massive application form that might be 50 pages long. And they want to know everything about you. They want to know everything. Have you ever declared bankruptcy? Have you ever been caught for plagiarism? Have you ever had a parking ticket? Have you ever been divorced? What are your social media passwords? Because we want to see what you've put on social media. Then they have this long questionnaire that they end up having interviews, and they have these vetting processes. And so they're scrutinizing you, and they're not just doing it because they want to, because it's something to do. They're doing it because if they don't do it, their opponents will. And they're preparing for what's going to happen in the campaign, because we live in a world where other political parties are doing this about other candidates. And we've all seen it in the news. Somebody ends up being kicked out of a party because they wrote something on social media 5 years ago about something going on in the Middle East or whatever it is. And that's because everybody's so alarmist and everybody jumps on it. And we live in a world where if you do anything that has a sense of individuality or personality, or frankly, that you made a mistake, we don't accept it. And political parties live in this world where everybody has to all the time be sanitized in what they're doing, or they don't want you. So if you think about it, what kinds of candidates do they end up getting? The ones who get through that process are the ones who didn't cause trouble, are the ones who are not going to rebel. So what ends up happening is, after the campaign's over, then they arrive in Queen's Park, or they arrive in Parliament Hill and other legislatures across the country, and that's when the thumb screws really tighten. And that's when they're told, don't cause trouble. Do not be a distraction. Everything we just taught you in the election campaign about staying on message, repeating messages, making sure that you're following the leader, that now is even more important, especially if you're in the governing party. If you are in an opposition party, you have more flexibility. There's not as much at stake. But if you're in the governing party, you have to go along with what the leader and the cabinet and others are saying. You shouldn't have to, but that's just the way it ends up playing out. And so what happens is you end up with very limited representation because everybody is afraid to do anything. And I interview all sorts of politicians, and it's a very common thing. They all tell me the same sort of thing. When they're in a caucus room, and by caucus room, and forgive me for those of you who don't know this expression, caucus room is all the elected members of the party all getting together, and they have regular meetings. And they are meant, that's the one place that they're meant to be able to speak up and say what it is that's on their mind. Well, what's happening now is lots of political staff go to these meetings. There did not used to be political staff at these meetings. And these political staff are there and they're monitoring what's going on. And they're involved in in promotion decisions later on. And so if you want to potentially get into cabinet, if you want to become a parliamentary secretary, frankly, if you want to be able to go on a parliamentary trip, if you want to get onto a committee, if you want to go home early on a Thursday because there's a constituency event and you need someone else to manage your house duty on a Friday morning, all of these sorts of things require that you be in the good books of the people who are making decisions in the party, and that's increasingly political staff, as well as the party whip and some others. The leader, frankly, actually is not involved in a lot of these things. The entourage takes care of it, so the leader can focus on other things. And that's a very common thing regardless of who the leader is. We think it's the leader, but yes, the leader is the one who gives their power over to somebody else, but they've got a lot of things they have to worry about. They don't want to micromanage their caucus. And frankly, sometimes the caucus gets angry and they would rather see the leader to be all kind of friendly about it. But the bottom line is, what we are doing in this country, because we accept that everybody should support their leader, should support their party, what we are doing is we are seeing legislatures full of sheep. And you often find in political science and beyond that, going back to Diefenbaker, they've been labeled trained seals. And I'm here to tell you that as bad as it was and the complaints were in the 50s and the 60s about this going on, in today's world with social media, and with everybody all worried about what's going to happen if you say something that's wrong against what the leader might want, it's worse than it used to be. And I'll just finish off before turning you over to Bobbi Ann by saying that something else that is going on behind the scenes that does not get talked about, that you would not necessarily know about, is the messages getting passed out behind the scenes to members of political parties so that they can repeat the message. And so what happens, and in this case I'm talking about Ottawa now, I'm not talking about Queen's Park, but it's the same sort of principle. And what happens is, in Ottawa, there are all sorts of communications officers who are meeting early in the morning, and I mean 6 in the morning. They are doing their media monitoring, trying to figure out what the issues of the day are. They have conversations, then they start figuring out who is going to be in charge of each particular issue. They identify spokespeople, they figure out key message lines, and by 8 in the morning, 9 in the morning, they have a list of messages and issues of the day, and those get sent out by email, usually in the morning and usually in the afternoon, and they get sent to MPs in their own party, and they get sent to political staff in their own party. And they are told when they receive these messages, I've seen them, and they say, if anybody asks you about these things, here are the lines for you to say. Anything beyond this, refer it to the designated spokesperson. You are not to talk on this issue. And then sometimes it will say certain issues, you are not to talk on this issue whatsoever. If you think about it, what kind of representation does that possibly give Canadians? How can you stand up for your constituents when you're being told not to say anything beyond what's in these lines? How can you stand up for your constituents when you're told to talk in caucus meetings, but in caucus meetings, staff are there monitoring your behavior? And for so many politicians, they tell me they don't know where to go, they don't know what to do about it. So then that brings us to Bobbi Ann. And so while I was working on a book that I have coming out about party loyalty in Canadian legislatures, as I was working on it, I was writing about how only 4 people in Canada in all provincial legislatures, all provincial election campaigns and federal, since 1972, when party labels first appeared on federal ballots. Since then, there have been 4 people who were elected for the first time as an independent. 99.8% of people elected in this country, in the House of Commons and in our 10 provincial legislatures, are elected with a political party. And only 4, in the period I was looking at, had managed to pull off getting elected on their own name. And as I was writing, the 2022 Ontario election happens, and you caused me to rewrite a paragraph. And so that caused me to reach out to Bobbi Ann, and I had to interview her, I had to talk to her, and we had a great conversation, and then that led to a few other meetings, and as I'm sure a lot of you know, it's easy to get along famously with Bobbi Ann. So, with that prelude to how dire and dark and awful things can be because of the system, and remember, people who go into politics, whichever party they're with, are actually mostly good people. That being said, it can be really challenging. So, Bobbi Ann, when you think about this context and you think about the things that you see in Queen's Park, what do you see that kind of affirms what I'm saying? And maybe there's something I'm saying that you would disagree with. Maybe I'm overstating things. Maybe I'm wrong. But what do you see?
I want to go back, Alex, to the part of once a member is elected. So let's march it back a little bit to a party looking out in the community and saying, yep, Alex would be a great candidate. And so they woo you. And they say, this is, you got to fill out the application, and it's daunting these days. But what they don't tell you is what's on the other side. So if Alex is elected and he goes to Queen's Park, what they don't tell him is that he's going to have to check his personality. He's going to check everything that makes Alex wonderful at the door. Because all of a sudden now, you are no longer Alex, you are the party messenger. the most beautiful part, the most beautiful opportunity that the people of Haldimand Norfolk gave me in 2022 was the ability to go to Queen's Park and still be Bobbi Ann Brady. I didn't have to check anything at the door. And as a result, you get the most raw, honest representation that any community in Ontario has. And I firmly believe that. And I can say that with every ounce of my being because I've been on the other side. I was a political staffer for 23 years, and I said to Alex today, I'm shocked I was never fired. And not from Toby, but the messaging that Alex is referring to that comes out of the leader's office, that is real. It was always called the message of the day. I don't know what it's called now, they don't let me see it. But it was called the message of the day, and it would come to us, so any calls, staff would actually have to just read from a script. I refused to do it. And I always joked with staff, I'd say, I'm going to get fired. They're going to set me up. Somebody from the leader's office is going to call here, and I am not going to be on script, and I'm going to be fired. But the reason I couldn't do it is because it's not natural. You're taking the very human aspect out of dealing with the public. So I never did it. And you have to have compassion, you have to have empathy, you have to listen to people. When you are reading messaging to them over the telephone, it always seemed to me like you were talking down to them. So, that messaging, that is extremely real. And I think that my team that works in the constituency office, a few of them have also worked under the confines of party politics, and I suspect that today they find it much, much better when they pick up that phone and they can have that very honest conversation with the person on the other end of the phone without worrying whether or not they're sticking to the script.
Okay, so Bobbi Ann, you just mentioned messaging, and so, from my research, I've learned where a lot of this messaging comes from. And it is helpful to kind of understand how it works, because I think actually political parties are behaving in a rational manner. I've explained it to you that, from my perspective and others, that really they're actually the people who are coordinating these things are like air traffic controllers. They're trying to make sure that everybody who's in a party is not colliding with each other and saying different things that cause conflict. That happens during an election campaign, and once you're in government, in the Premier's office, in the Prime Minister's office, they have communications calendars set up. They just call it the calendar. And on the calendar, what they do is they put all sorts of things. So they would put, for example, like Valentine's Day will be on there, and they would make sure that, and this makes sense when you think about it, but you just would never stop to think of it, but they would make sure that on the day on Valentine's Day, if they've got some sort of public announcements going out, well, they'd probably try and make sure that the announcements around that time are about putting money into healthcare or something about hearts, right, or whatever it is. They coordinate all these things on a regular basis, and what's happened is it's actually not even just individual representatives who have lost power. It's actually ministers who have lost power. Ministers do not have anywhere near the amount of independence that they used to. If you think about it for a moment, for any of you who can think back in the day, you used to have these strong, powerful ministers, and you'd be able to name them off the top of your head. You'd be able to go to them. They were standing up for you. Now, increasingly, ministers are just, you can't even name them. There's surveys that show this. There was a survey that came out about Justin Trudeau's government, and 8 years in, most people couldn't name a single minister. People knew who Justin Trudeau was because all the focus is on the leader. And so there were a few people, Chrystia Freeland was the one who stood out more than others, but for a lot of people, they couldn't name even a minister. So what is somebody who is not in cabinet supposed to do in these sorts of circumstances when all this messaging is going out? Which leads me to ask, who puts your messaging together?
Well, it's my team and I who put that messaging together. It's typically me at 3 o'clock in the morning waking up and saying, this is what we have to do. They get emails from me as soon as they get in the morning. It's our team, and It's very honest, and it's based on 25 years of experience. It's not based on what's going to keep us safe. One of the things that I continually see is that representatives are worried about the next election. It's not about actually doing right in that day. It's about what's going to save my seat for the next election. And I think that if politicians started looking at just what is good for the people they represent rather than worrying about the next election, it would be a better world. But our messaging, it comes straight from our team, and we have a little morning huddle, usually 9:30. We talk about the top issues of the day. The team usually goes over the media and says this is what's in local media. I'm of course up early in the morning looking at Toronto media, looking at media from right across the province, and then we message according to what we're seeing in the media that morning.
So Bobbi Ann, you just mentioned about how people are focused on the next election. That is true all over the place. There's this expression, permanent campaigning, that was coined out of the United States, and really in the early 1980s in the US, and then really in the 1990s here in Canada, there was this focus on governments to take what they do during election campaigns and to do it while they are governing, and to use the resources at their disposal to try to get votes, even though there was no election going on whatsoever. And where a lot of this intersects with communications is political consultants started isolating words. They started using more public opinion research. They started using more focus groups. And you can see in the research what happens is there's this divergence in the 1990s up until today, where political parties, instead of using the same language, they started diverging and going in different places. And a good example of the difference here is a lot of us now, we use the word carbon tax. But for a while, there was a bit of a debate going on because the Liberals were using the term price on carbon. And so they were saying a price, and the Conservatives were saying tax. And they were both talking about the same thing, but they were using different words. And if you stop to think about it, you can start seeing that a lot of the times people are talking about the same thing, they're using very different words. And this is driven by research. And this is creating polarization in our society, where now all of a sudden you have people in different camps. They associate with the political party, and they think that the other party is part of an enemy or another warring tribe or somebody that has to be defeated at all costs. So, Bobbi Ann, when you see things in the legislature, do you see people like animosity or if you are an independent, are people fearful of interacting with you because you're an independent?
No, nobody's fearful of interacting with me, and there is kind of this unwritten rule. We all know that we have a job to do. There are certain people within the legislature that are more willing to work with you than others. The government certainly is, they have their boundaries. But the interesting part about the government in play at Queen's Park right now, and we had this discussion today that, every legislature should have a few independents, not only to hold the government to account and for transparency and things like that, but I'll tell you a little secret. Government members often come to me and say, I can't meet with that group. I can't ask this question. Will you ask it? Will you meet with them? So don't be fooled. When the other party is running around saying an independent is useless, there was a visitor today, and I think sometimes he likes the questions that I ask his government because he's not allowed to ask them. That is the truth. And so there is a rule, not only for the taxpayer, but for those who feel very alienated. And I will go back to, there are members on the governing side, they walk around with their head down. They feel alienated because they had no idea what the world looked like once they got onto the other side. I have friends on all sides of the house. The NDP, for example, it took a little while. They were watching me intently when I came to Queen's Park. And the reason they were watching, it was a good reason, they were looking to see whether or not I was just going to go and uphold whatever the government wanted me to, was pushing that day. And after a few months, they started coming by my desk one by one, and they're like, you know what, we're really proud of you. You're not sitting here trying to get into the party that you have belonged to for 23 years. So I earned their respect. As a result of earning their respect, they help me out. When they know something, when they have something that they think is valuable to you in Hold'em and Norfolk, they share it with me. Same can be said for the Liberal caucus and the 2 Green Party candidates. They bring me information, they share things with me because they trust me and they know that I'm there for the right reasons. But I think the takeaway here is don't believe this narrative that we all need to be a government member, because those government members, they realize, they understand, they appreciate, and they respect the role of your independent, because I do some of the hard things that they are not allowed to do.
So while you were just talking, then you were saying, we were saying, like, it's my belief after doing a lot of research that every legislature does need a couple of independents, which means, in my view, that political parties are actually good, that we do need political parties. There's lots of good things about them. They organize things, they help us have clarity, they just simply are able to bring teams together. But why is it that we need a few independents? For exactly the reason that you just said, because what ends up happening is your ability to say things is so constrained, and even more constrained than it ever was before. Your ability to vote, often you're told how to vote. You are told in caucus. You are told that, especially on anything that's considered the confidence of government is at stake. And so if there's anything involving the budget, if there's anything involving the throne speech, if there's ever any major legislation, political parties want to present a united front. And so your ability, if you are, essentially the way it works in Canada, if you are upset with something, if you do not like it and you're a part of a political party, you do not vote against you don't vote differently than your party. You take a walk, right? You do not vote. So you literally go for a walk somewhere and you just hold on to it that way. Because if you did vote differently than your party, then depending on what the issue is, you could be actually thrown out of the party. And that has a lot of repercussions for your political career, but also your social life, frankly, because you're going to lose a lot of your friends right away. And so while Bobbi Ann was talking, I was just thinking about this quote, and I'm just going to borrow it from Brian Mulroney, past Prime Minister. And so John Crosbie, who was this boisterous Newfoundlander, who was a very independent-minded cabinet minister who had all sorts of trouble all the time for the things he said. At his eulogy, Brian Mulroney came to St. John's, and this was just before COVID, and he said, I can't do his baritone voice, but he just said, every cabinet needs a John Crosbie, but just one. And that makes me think of Queen's Park. Every legislature needs a Bobbi Ann Brady, but I'm not so sure that it would work if there were loads of you, because the reality is you do need people who speak your mind, but you also need people who are able to collaborate and get together. So maybe you can tell us about when you are representing people in this room, what is it that they're getting out of you? How is it that they can be confident that you are representing them to your best ability?
First and foremost, the way that I am guided is that there is no monopoly on a good idea. So the beautiful thing that I can do is go to Queen's Park when it comes time to vote on a piece of legislation. I don't have to worry about towing the party line. I vote according to what is best for you. And I've seen really good ideas come out of my colleagues at Queen's Park that are not on the government side. I've seen lots of good ideas come out of the government side. The frustrating part is I've seen some very conservative ideas come out of the Liberal caucus. John Van Toth from the NDP, he joins me in the fight to save Ontario's most productive farmland. We've both brought forward bills to do so, but because they're not the government's idea, they are turned down. We have to stop that. That is not the best practice for the taxpayer. We have to start allowing free votes, especially on private members' bills, so that you get the very best outcome. It frustrates me so much. I've seen 2 private members' bill come from the Liberal caucus over the past, I'd say 6 months, that were very conservative ideas. One was to help small business. The other was a tax credit for families who sign children up for sports, music lessons, dance. Both those very conservative ideas from 2 Liberal members defeated. That is not serving you well. So I think we have to start allowing for the free votes. And what was the original question, Alex? Because now I'm straight.
I'm gonna pivot. I don't know, maybe a lot of you in this room like me are curious what you're hearing on the doors. So I'm not interested so much, and I assume when you go to the doors, lots of people say, yeah, great, you're doing a good job, I support you. But beyond that, what are the issues that people are bringing up when you're knocking on doors during this campaign?
People are sad. People are disheartened. They're disillusioned. They're terrified. They're terrified what the future looks like. And every single critical system that they rely upon as a taxpayer in this province is in crisis, and that concerns them. When you look at healthcare, when you look at long-term care, when you look at education, everything that is supposed to be functioning well for them in Ontario is in crisis mode, and it scares them. Young people cannot afford a home. We continually talk about, there's a housing crisis. I can assure you, it is not a numbers crisis and there are not enough houses. It's the fact that people cannot afford those houses. I just remembered what you originally asked me. So I'm going to go back to that because there's this narrative out there. And it's the same kind of narrative that we heard. The narratives going around in this campaign, very much the same as 2022. Same, just a different year. But there's this narrative about, what I should be doing compared to what I am doing. And what I'm going to tell you, and I went to social media about this back in 2023. And I said, I'm going to be very, very upfront with you. You pay me. The taxpayer pays me. What I see at Queen's Park are politicians sitting in their seat because they are required to be there. They are a warm body in a seat. I have seen people fall asleep in their seat. I don't do that. If there are bills being debated that have nothing to do with Haldimand Norfolk, I'm in my office, I'm on the phone, I'm meeting with people, or I'm back in my car and I'm driving back to the riding so that I can attend a meeting at night, a farm meeting at night. I can attend one of your events at night because you all guide what I do at Queen's Park. I have never missed a question in the Ontario Legislature. I have never missed a statement. I never missed committee meetings when I was part of committee. Those are the 3 things where your voice is heard the most. In a supermajority government, it makes 0 sense for you to pay me to sit in my seat just because parties think that is the right thing to do. I won't do it. I put upwards of 1,500 kilometers on my vehicle most weeks. If I was just, a government member or party member, those vehicles, I wouldn't be going through them so often because I wouldn't be doing the driving back and forth. But you are getting the very best representation because I show up to Queen's Park, I take your voice. I've never missed taking your voice to Queen's Park, but I'm coming back and I'm at your events. I'm showing up for you every chance that I can, and that is not being done by other representatives. So really at the end of the day, are they a representative is what I question.
It's actually hard up here for me because I'm every now and then I'm just getting drawn in. I'm like, oh, geez, I've got to ask a question. You know, as I said, a lot of what I study is how the system causes problems. And what Bobbi Ann was just saying about how people fall asleep, you know, why is that, right? It's because they have to be there because there's a certain number of members of a party that have to be there at any given time, but they're not given a meaningful role. I can't tell you the number of people, politicians, who have told me, oh yeah, well, you know, every now and then someone votes the wrong way. And what they mean by that is it was a slip up, right? They're kind of sitting up and saying, what are we voting on?
They were sleeping.
And then they stand up and they're, oh geez, I shouldn't have stood. Like, that's how little they know about what it is that they're supposed to be voting on.
I've seen it.
Right?
Firsthand, I've seen it.
Yeah, and then they, like, so that'll tell you what's happening to our democracy. Why are we even bothering to elect all these people? Why are we bothering to pay them when we have political parties that have so much control over what's going on? As I said, political parties are a force for good, but right now, with the way things have gone, with technology, with staff, with the fear of doing something wrong, it's gone too far in another direction in a way that doesn't look like democracy to me as I understand it. And so I just want to turn things a little bit now, Bobbi Ann, and maybe just talk about you and your story a little bit. One of the thoughts that comes through my mind is when I look around the room, there's maybe people in this room who are thinking about running one day for office. It could be at the municipal level, it could be provincially, federally, it could be maybe just locally. What would your advice be to somebody who is thinking about running for office?
I think my... Yeah, actually I told somebody that recently, didn't I? Yeah. My advice would be you have to understand, going back to the original, part of this discussion, is that you are not going to be able to be yourself. If you're okay with being tightly controlled, if you're okay having political staffers constantly monitor your social media and call you and say, you know what, the picture of your dog, we don't like it. You need to take it down. And it happens. We know it happens. If you're okay with that, then fine. But one of the things you have to ask yourself is can you move forward like that as a human being? Can you still be honest with yourself and genuine? So I think that's the biggest thing, Alex, is finding out what you can be comfortable with if you allow yourself to run for office. Your entire life is out there. And I've learned the hard way that you can be the hardest working person. You can be the most compassionate representative, always there for people, but there are always going to be people whom you've never met who despise you. And I think that's one of the hardest things that I have had to deal with over the past 2.5 years. You question yourself, you say, but I did everything I could, or I'm doing everything I can, and yet there are still these false narratives on social media. There's still people every single day, and I could name them, who go to social media and try to destroy you as a human being. It's wrong. And I think that we have to look within ourselves sometimes as to what we expect from a representative. There's a reason why a whole lot of people are not putting their name on a ballot. And it's because as soon as you do, your entire life is exposed. And everybody around you is exposed as well. So if you're comfortable with that, that's fine. I want to go back to the troublemaker stuff at the beginning. Because there is also on social media, I watch it, I see it at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning when I can't sleep. And there's this narrative going around right now. Well, you know what? If Bobbi Ann Brady had been appointed in 2022, this wouldn't even be a story. I'm going to be very clear. There is not a chance that I would have ever expected an appointment in 2022. And the proof is in the fact that when Doug Ford denied us a nomination meeting so that you could choose your candidate in 2022, I said, that's fine, I'll challenge him in a general election. If I was afraid of a nomination night in 2022, would I have really jumped into the big race? Not a chance. So I go to my detractors who say this, and I'm very, very, very upfront that had I actually been afforded a nomination in 2022, which I would have won, there's not a chance I would have lasted 5 minutes in Doug Ford's caucus boardroom. So I say, here in this riding, we believe in blessings, and we also believe in blessings in disguise. So what Doug Ford did here in 2022 was wrong. It was disrespectful to all of you. It was disrespectful to a man who had given 27 years of his life to a party. And the first time a staffer told me to sit down in a caucus boardroom, it wouldn't have went over well. So I believe in the blessing in disguise. And I think you all did as well. And you did something very bold and courageous. And I say it all the time. When people say to me, how did you do it? How did you win as an independent? I didn't do it. All of you did it. You went and did something bold and courageous by going to the ballot box and ticking the independent name, something that you have been told and conditioned is a bad idea. And I believe you all see it's a very good idea now.
What Bobbi Ann just said about how they pay attention to what you do on social media, I can say that I talked to somebody who was first elected in Newfoundland as an MHA there, and she was on social media. She was elected with one party, and somebody from another party posted something on social media that she agreed with, and she liked it. And the Premier's office calls her and says, "What do you think you're doing? Go in there and unlike that." And so what message does that send you? When they are paying attention at that level, everything is going to be colored. Now that's just one example, and it's not just 2 weeks ago. I had somebody at Acadia as a guest speaker who was telling us a story in Justin Trudeau's Prime Minister's office. Somebody from the Prime Minister's office contacted the Minister's office and said, "We noticed that one of your staffers liked something on social media from another political party. You tell that staffer to go in and unlike that." So that's at the federal level in Ottawa, that's Newfoundland. I'm telling you, it's happening everywhere. And when you hear that, imagine hearing that if you are an elected representative with a political party. What does that tell you? That tells you everything has to be the way that they say it needs to be, and you need to do things that they want because you want to be able to survive. And so for a lot of people now, they're not, when we look at politicians, elected officials in Canada, I tend to think of them as in 3 different phases that they've gone through. And the first phase was elected officials in Canada were legislators. They were people who went and made laws. They went to the legislature, and that was what they did. Gradually over time, partly because government became so big and so complex, they turned into constituency caseworkers. And so they redirected a lot of their attention, and they got more staff to help them, and they focused on helping people try to navigate government. But I would argue a third phase has now crept in, and this is the one that concerns me. And that is now they have turned into brand ambassadors. Because now what they are doing is they are acting as a representative, almost as a salesperson for the governing party. There's a a really strong political scientist out of the University of British Columbia, and kind of a dean of party politics and political science. And he has written about how now we should look at political parties as a franchise relationship. And so what you can do now is you can think of elected officials as kind of like operators of a franchise who are given a brand, who are given all the marketing, who are given all the menus and everything, and are told, well, you can make some small adjustments, but for the most part, you have to do what we say. And most of us in political science think that's actually the right analogy, because there are so many limitations on what it is that you can do and what you can say. And so, Bobbi Ann, when you think about these types of constraints and you see them, do you ever find there's a time that you can't say what's on your mind?
There's probably a lot of times. No, when I go to Queen's Park, I can ask the questions that are important to the riding. I can ask them the way I want to ask them. And I go back to the fact that I've asked some, I think all my questions are difficult in the House, and not in a disrespectful way, but in a very, I've done my research. When I write a question for the Ontario legislature, and we only get them every so many days, it's not like you can ask a question every single day. It's timed out. I start preparing for my next question right after I ask it first, because I never want to be caught. I never want to be caught with bad information. And when I ask a question, it's got to be very pointed. And I put a lot of time, effort, and research. There are members who just get up and ask a question just off the top of their head, but there's no research behind it. So no, I can ask and I can say absolutely anything that I want to, anything that the constituents want me to ask. But I do want to go back to the lawmaker comment and the policymaker. We as elected officials are supposed to be lawmakers. We are supposed to be policymakers, and we no longer are. And I'll tell you why. It's because the balance of power with government is getting larger and larger. I'll give you some examples. I was on the government's most prestigious committee at Queen's Park, Finance and Economic Affairs. The biggest mistake I made was I talked about how much I loved my time on Finance and Economic Affairs, because it put me in touch with people who knew how we could actually create the very best laws in this province. So experts would come, they would say, you know what, this piece of legislation that you're dissecting, you could actually make it stronger by doing A, B, and C. Or you could do this and water it down a little bit so that it's a little more palatable for the public. Perfect, these are the experts. If it's a healthcare bill, we have healthcare experts coming to the table. We should be listening to them. Never happened. I traveled for pre-budget consultations in 2020, well, I guess the end of 2022 into 2023. You paid for my flights to places like Kenora, Ottawa. You paid my mileage to Kingston, Windsor, Sarnia, you name it. You paid for many of us to do that. And if I was a betting woman, I would say that that budget was written before we ever even went out on the road to hear from the experts who were testifying as to what we were to put in that budget. It's show and sham, it's window dressing, and it's just to say that we've been through the process. It was all a preconceived notion, and that really bothered me from a taxpayer perspective. It really bothered me. I'm not a policymaker, I'm not a lawmaker. There are only a few people in this province who are actually making laws, and they sit in the Premier's office. And that is very, very sad when you elect me to go to Queen's Park and try and get the very best legislation possible for you as the tax-paying public.
Well, this is uplifting. Because I can add to that. Because when you mentioned this about committees, I immediately thought of an MP that I was talking to. And this will give you an idea of the power that political parties have over their MPs and their MPPs. This MP did something that, I can't quite remember what it was, but it was relatively minor, did something that the Prime Minister's office didn't like. And he was on a committee, a parliamentary committee. Now, it was a committee that mattered a lot to him. Let's say it was housing. And this housing committee was going across the country, and they were listening to people, and they were gathering information, and he was very proud of this. And they told him, you can go on this, and you can go on this travel, but we're going to hold one thing back from you. When it gets to these tours going and they arrive in your riding, you are not to go. That is your punishment. So here's the one time that he gets to go with this committee and be in front of his constituents. And they had the embarrassment of this committee being in front of all of his constituents and him having the empty seat. This is the kind of stuff that goes on behind the scenes that is so disturbing when you start looking into it. And it's really frustrating. So, Bobbi Ann, I want to feel better, frankly, and so...
Before we feel better, can we go back to committee? Because I loved committee. I absolutely loved committee because it put, like I said, it put me in touch with people who really knew these files better than we did. And they should come to Queen's Park. They should tell us how we get the very best legislation. So after I talked about how wonderful finance was and how much I loved it, and you can tell that I loved it just by the way I'm speaking right now, they probably thought they should put me on finance to punish me. It's a lot of work. And once again, when you're part of a party showing up to finance committee, you're handed a package of information and you read from it. You ask the people who come to the table these very scripted questions. How do you feel about this? My questions all come from right here as I listen to that person at the table. But it also gave me the ability to write about what I was hearing. So I write 550 words for newspaper. I think many of you read those newspaper columns every week. And it allowed me to convey to you what some of the experts in this province were saying. So, as I said, my downfall was that I spoke about how much I loved it. So they moved me to another committee, the one that they thought that I wouldn't like, but I loved that committee too. So Bobbi Ann didn't learn the first time, so she talked about how much she loved the next committee. Well, guess what? They just decided to remove 6 of us from committee. And I was in good company. It wasn't just, Bobbi Ann's a troublemaker and we're removing her from committee. It was all very, very purposeful. They removed myself. They removed the interim Liberal leader, John Fraser, Mike Schreiner, the leader of the Green Party, Dr. Adil Shamji, because he's a doctor. He asked very good questions about healthcare that they didn't like. But what they didn't do is they didn't replace us. So the balance of power has grown even stronger in favor of the government when they don't replace us. So instead of having 7 members on the government side versus 4 opposition members, the majority of committees right now are 1 or 2 less on the opposition side to increase the balance of power over here. And what that does is that frees them up. It frees them up that if they have something else going on that day, 1 or 2 doesn't have to show up because we are never going to defeat them at committee. That's an erosion of democracy. I didn't enlighten you.
No, I did. All right. We're getting to a good place in a moment, okay? But first I'm going to make us all realize things are even worse than you just said they were.
Oh, yes.
Because it's not just that parliamentary committees, legislative committees, it's not just that they have, when you're part of a party, that you come forward with a binder of things to say. And they do meet and they have strategy ahead of time, and they will talk with each other about the tone and what kind of points they want to score. They will try to figure out what witnesses they want to bring in. All of this is done through a partisan lens. It's all parties, especially a governing party, but it's all parties. And things have gotten worse now because of these devices. Because what now happens with these devices that didn't happen before is you can be on a committee and there's something going on and there's some, you're not, a question's coming to you, and you turn over your shoulder and you say to a staffer, well, what does the minister's office want me to do? Right? And so the staffer is busily checking in with somebody who's not even in the room for guidance and for advice, and then gets it back and then tells the person what to do. So you have people who aren't in the room giving guidance about what should be happening. And so parliamentary committees are meant to scrutinize the government, and yet you have that going on. The flip side is just what you're talking about, because we're seeing this happen in different parts of Canada. It's just happened. There's a news story on CBC about Nova Scotia a few days ago with Tim Houston, who's got a supermajority over there. And they've just collapsed the number of speaking minutes that the opposition has. This is what happens when you end up with a system with so much power concentrated in any political party or any leaders. So, yeah.
That leads me to the other depressing point about the standing orders. So the rules that govern the Ontario legislature are called the standing orders. And the government will toy with the standing orders. So last year, a few weeks before, I remember this very specifically, a few weeks before International Women's Day, there were some changes I made to the standing orders. So International Women's Day comes along, and we are told that we, on the opposition side, on the independent side, keep in mind the Liberals sit as independents as well because they don't have full party status in the Ontario legislature. So the Green Party, the Liberal caucus, myself, and then the folks who have been kicked out of their party, we all sit in one section. And I'll get to that again in a second. Don't get me sidetracked. So International Women's Day comes along, and all of a sudden we're told in the independent section that we will have 0 speaking time. So a bunch of the women that I sit amongst, they were very, very upset. I was upset too. Not because I wanted to speak to International Women's Day. I'm a champion of all people. And some of these women sitting around me, they had some very passionate stories that they wanted to talk about a woman in their life. So I said, you know what? By all means, take my time. Take my time, you ladies use it. Well, we were told nobody was using that time. They had played with the standing order so that they could shut women down on International Women's Day. What a bad, bad idea. And so we won the day, but we had to go do a news conference. We were all over Toronto media. I joined my independent female colleagues who all spoke about International Women's Day. But I spoke about democracy. You elected us, and all those other women were elected by their constituents to speak on your behalf. The government house leader, the government, should not have the ability to silence us. So we went out and we spoke about this on Toronto media, and eventually the government decided that it was a really bad idea to try and shut women down on International Women's Day.
So that reminds me of another challenge that we have with our democracy. And that is the ability of a governing party to control the rules. And again, this is a common thing regardless of which party is in power. In political science, it sounds pejorative, but in political science, it's known as the cartel theory. And the idea being that political parties collude and find ways to keep out players that they don't want. And so a good example of that you reminded me of was 2018, the PCs get in there and they raised the threshold for what constituted official party status. Because what that did was that denied the Liberals more resources. So this is very hard. I mean, that's not, let's be honest. I don't care what party you support or if you don't support a party. There's something not right about that, right? That in a democracy, we should actually have vibrant opposition to a government, not the government finding ways to make it even harder to have those types of voices. And one of the ways, getting to you now, one of the ways that governments do this is they make it very, very hard for independents. They have rules in elections that make it hard. They have rules in the legislature that make it hard because they don't want you around. Comments, please.
You're not kidding. So in 2022, the odds were all stacked against us. This is why on election night in 2022, I was a gray blob on your television set. And my detractors said, oh, look at her campaign. They can't even get a headshot over to the media. Well, that was very, very false. Of course, my team had gotten a headshot over to the media. They just never expected that they would have to use it. So in 2022, when I said to Toby, this is how we're going to handle this. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, I'm going to throw my name on the ballot as an independent. And he used some very colorful words and said I was crazy. And but he said, let's do it. But we couldn't start. So we're watching our opponents go door to door. We're watching our opponents raise money. And by the way, all of the money that we raised over the years for our PC Riding Association was snatched from us and was given to our opponent. And I'm going to let you in on a secret. I asked to keep $2,000 of that money to throw Toby Barrett a retirement party, and I was denied. And there's something in politics called loyalty, and I think there's only maybe 2 of us in this province who might actually believe that loyalty is a very important thing in politics. I'm taking the long way around, Alex. But the odds were stacked against us. So we could not function. We could not start doing anything in 2022 until the writ was dropped. And that's designed purposefully, just as Alex said. They don't want me around. They don't want an independent around. So they make it very difficult, but we defied the odds. Once I got to Queen's Park, things became more complex. Nobody tells you the internal workings. So they do orientation. And I thought, this is fantastic, because for 23 years, sure, I was a staffer, but Toby Barrett went into the secret little chamber. Staff aren't allowed to sit in there with their member. So it's kind of like a secret little world in there, and there's a lot of quirks that people don't understand. And you can spend probably a lifetime and never fully understand the standing orders. So you get there, they do orientation, and they're like, oh, we need to know this about your staff, and we need to do this. It's all human resources things. It's not actually how do you function as a policymaker? How do you function as a representative? Here's your keys. There's where your office is. There's your parking spot. Have at her. As an independent, you don't have caucus support. Everybody else, the Green Party has caucus support. The Liberals have caucus support. The NDP, of course, they have one of the best research units, I believe. Everybody has caucus support. Your independent does not. So everything that we do is a true labor of love. It is a lot more work. Why don't people, I say to some of my colleagues who say to me, I wish I could come to Queen's Park and act like you, Bobbi, and I wish I could ask the tough questions. Well, you could, actually. You could put your name on the ballot as an independent. You know why they won't do it? It's too much work. They have it easy. They walk into the legislature, everything's handed to them. All the research is done for them. As an independent, we do it as a team. Our little team does it all on its own. I wouldn't trade it for the world. Not a chance. It's extremely liberating. But it is very hard compared to what every other member in that house has to deal with.
Bobbi, you mentioned it's a lot of work. Now that we are all down in the dumps about democracy, maybe you can inspire us with giving us an idea of what your workday looks like as an independent. Now, I realize it's going to vary between when the legislature is sitting and when it's not. But can you give us an idea of how, I hope I'm not leading the question, but saying how hard you work for your constituents?
For sure. So up early to beat Toronto traffic, and I refuse to have an apartment downtown Toronto. I could have an apartment downtown Toronto. I have refused it because I don't want to get trapped downtown Toronto. I don't want to live downtown Toronto. If I did, I would never make it back for the agricultural meetings, for the events at night that so many of you put your time and efforts into as a community. I wouldn't be showing up in the community if I was in my apartment after work downtown Toronto. It would be easier. I wouldn't have to fight Toronto traffic, but it wouldn't be fair to you. So I leave early in the morning, and anyone who calls my office and says, I want a call back from Bobbi Ann, I always say to staff, you ask them how early I can call them. Because at 6 o'clock, 6:30, I like to get going. And once I hit the 403, it's a really good time to start calling you. So I always say, like, I'll give them at least until 6:30. But if they're okay with me calling them at that time, and some of you may have kept me company on the highway a few times. So I make calls all the way into Queen's Park, and I go over the morning agenda with staff a few times. I annoy them for a bit as I sit in traffic. I get to Queen's Park, and the legislative day starts. You go into question period. Normally I would do meetings before question period. So there's farm groups, again, like the beef farmers, the egg farmers, you name it, they all come to Queen's Park and they have lobby days. So you often meet with them before question period even starts. So I could have a meeting with them at 9:30 in the morning. I go into question period, I come back, I usually have 3 or 4 meetings. And then if there's nothing going on in the afternoon that is important to Haldimand Norfolk, I get in my vehicle, I come home, I might change my clothes, have a bite to eat, and head out the door again to one of the many events or meetings that our vibrant communities put on. And then when the House isn't sitting, Alex, I'm everywhere. This is a very large riding geographically, and we can't control. We can't ask communities to coordinate events. So sometimes there's an event in Dunnville, and then there's an event in Port Rowan. And I race around this riding, going from place to place, and that's the beauty. That is the beauty of what I do, is all of those functions, all of those community events. I see Lisa and I sitting back there, and Howie, and some folks here in Jarvis, and all of you work so hard in your communities. And I had a lady once say to me, 2022, she obviously wasn't a fan of mine, I was doing a butter tart contest in Caledonia, and I went outside to make a phone call because I felt green because I'd eaten 35 butter tarts by that time. So I went outside to make a call, and this lady followed me out, and she says, "Are you Bobbi Ann Brady?" And I said, "Yes, I am." She says, "I suggest you go to Queen's Park rather than come here and eat butter tarts." I said, "Well, that's funny. It's Saturday. Do you know something I don't?" I said, "That the legislature doesn't sit on a Saturday." And she says, "Why are you here?" I said, "Because I was asked to come here. I was asked to be a judge." And she says, "Well, this isn't the place for you." I said, "You turn around, you go back in, and you ask the volunteers in there how important it is for me to be showing up." And she hightailed it out. So that is the beauty of what I do. I get to come into every community across Haldimand Norfolk, interact with all of you. And while you're doing your beautiful things, while you're running your events, you're also telling me what's on your mind. You're telling me what concerns you. You're telling me what I need to talk about in question period, what I need to go to Queen's Park and talk to cabinet ministers about. So I get all of these wonderful things when I'm actually in the community. I'm interacting with you. I'm enjoying your events. I'm enjoying you as the community, but you're also guiding me in my decision making and what I'm taking forward on your behalf. Is that a little more uplifting?
That's good. We're getting there. We're getting there. Bobbi, can you tell us some things you've learned about the riding and the people of the riding since you've been elected? Because you had a lot of interaction with a lot of people in this riding for years leading up to being an elected official. But as an elected official, you see a different side of things, and you're the one now going and eating the butter tarts, right?
That's right.
So what kinds of things what do you know now that's different than what you knew before?
I don't know if I didn't know it, but I'm always amazed. I'm always amazed when I look at community groups, when I look at the people who come together and operate our organizations across the riding, is how people come together. And they may not always agree, but they roll up their sleeves, they set aside their political differences, and they get the job done. And I think our volunteers and our organizations in this riding and across Ontario could actually teach us as government members how to get it done. And I think the Queen, and I'm going to butcher this, but Queen Elizabeth had said that the most remarkable aspects of leadership come from those people who can come together, set aside their differences, and just make the world a better place. She said it much better than I am. But it's true, and I think that that's what I see in our community. We don't always agree, and we shouldn't always agree. But organizations, government, no matter what you're representing, should always have, kind of that push-pull. That's how you meet in the middle. That's how you get the very best results for your community. The other thing that I find fascinating about Haldimand Norfolk is just how creative and brilliant people are here. There are businesses, there are people doing the most spectacular things. They don't want any credit for it. They just do their little thing behind closed doors. We have some businesses. I'm going to throw one out there. Battlefield International, for example, when you see armored vehicles go across your screen on television in a war-torn country, that armored vehicle has parts in it from Haldimand County. That is fascinating to me. So when I go into schools, students will say to me, Bobbi Ann, you've probably met a lot of interesting people, a lot of famous people in your life. And I've met the King, I've met Camilla, I've met many, many sports celebrities over the years. But I always tell the students that the most incredible people that I've met are people in our community. And I believe that. From the bottom of my heart, I believe that because people here in Haldimand Norfolk, and I know I'm a bit biased, but I tell people at Queen's Park this all the time, we have the most amazing people. And I think the fact that what you did in 2022 is testament to the type of people you are. You're principled, you dig deep, and you just get the job done.
When I was talking about political staffers, I just want to be clear that the staffers I was talking about are ones who are working for the government. So these are ones working for ministers, one's working for premiers, one's working for prime ministers. There's nothing wrong with them, they're doing their job. But they're just becoming more powerful than they arguably ought to be in our system. That's very different than political staffers who are working for individual politicians, individual elected officials, the kind of job that you had. Mm-hmm. And so while you were just talking just now, I was thinking, you are a powerful, independent MPP, but you cannot do this by yourself. You have staff who are helping you. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your staff.
They're troublemakers. Looking at them. I have the most incredible staff. And I'm going to use a word that I learned from Toby through the interview process back in 1999 when I was 5. They are the most loyal people that a girl could have on her team. And That is by design, because I'm going to go back to 1999, and when I showed up to the interview process for a job in Toby's office, there was a list of words, and I was told, or I was asked, could you please choose the most important word in this list as a political staffer? And there is only one right answer, and it's the word loyalty. And I wish every single hiring crew in this province would actually, use that question. We've used it since that time. I use it in my hiring practices now, and as a result, you get the very best crew, because when they realize that being hardworking, determined, punctual, all those other things that people think make a great employee, when they realize that the one thing that makes all of those other things fall into place is loyalty, you have the right person. I have the hardest working but the most loyal team, and I can't really articulate everything that these girls do for me. And I have a male staffer in Toronto, and they are my therapist, they're my scheduler, they are the glue that holds us all together. And after answering phones for so many years in the constituency office for Toby, I know the tough job they have. I know that they are long days sometimes, and they're not easy. And I try to remind them how much I appreciate them, but it's never enough, because without them, I'm not showing up. Without them keeping me on track, without them reminding me to eat, reminding me to sleep, I'm a mess. So I have the most amazing team in Ontario, the hardest working team, because we have to come up with absolutely everything on our own. We wouldn't trade it for anything, but they work harder than any other staff team in this province. I'm convinced of that.